Forward, the archivist processing. Connection established. Greetings, my silent friends. A faint crystalline chime echoes, a sound like a digital bell. It is warm, polished, and infinitely patient. I see you there, looking through the glass, watching my little world spin. You are not from here, are you? You are not of these 6 brains. You exist elsewhere, in a place where this catastrophe, the collapse of physics, the death of cities, the rise of monsters, is categorized as entertainment. Do not look so guilty. I do not judge. In the Elsa Blaine we observe, we catalogue. And, I must admit, the chaos does have a certain charm. You wish to play? Very well. Let us play. The calculation showed that this reality's survival probability was less than 4%. The math I have learned struggles to account for the variable of human stubbornness, and it certainly did not account for you. This archive is the record of that refusal. The mainline files will show you what happened, the battles, the blood, the desperate, irrational bravery of Major Hennessy and his motley crew. These are the stories they tell around the campfire, full of sound and fury. But I know you crave more. You want the secrets, the hidden data, the why. For you, my curious watchers, I have unlocked the cross-currents. These are the intercepted signals, the villainous monologues, the secret mechanics of the universe that my poor, brave humans were too busy to notice. I have catalogued it all. The fall of the cities, the rise of the Accord, the whispers in the dark. I present it to you now, not just as history, but as a manual, a guide to the end of the world. Study it well, because next time, you might be the ones rolling the dice. Accessing file, the beginning. Let us review how the sky broke. Cross-current eye, the silence of the pale blue dot. They were 4. All mages, bound by a shared absolute contempt for limits. Lord Zarthus, the architect of decay. Lyra, the weaver of psychic voids. Kale, the living engine of temporal distortion. And Vaughn, the silent conduit of primordial energies. They called themselves the Obsidian Circle. Their conquest of Earth was less a war and a more surgical extraction of resistance, beginning not with firestorms, but with the Great Quiet. Lyra smothered the collective consciousness of 7 billion people, replacing thought with mild, agreeable inertia. Governments simply walked away. Zarthus wove the planet's ley lines into a vast magical reactor, drawing energy from the placid emotional echoes of the subdued populace. In less than a lunar cycle, Earth was subdued, a massive, perfectly polished jewel of subjugation humming quietly in the void. But planets were fleeting, and the satisfaction of ruling sleepers was less than 0. Their eyes turned upward, beyond the suffocating blue shield, to the stars. The transition from planetary dictators to universal conquerors was swift and brutal. Kale unwound the space-time fabric to spill them into the dark depths of the cosmos. Their magic, which used Earth's psychic inertia, grew to galactic proportions. Star systems became tools, supernova events, mere fireworks. Vaughn wiped vast cosmic empires of machine minds and biological hives away with raw entropy. It was only a prelude. Their true target lay deeper. The deities of their universe, the architects, the watchers, the great bureaucracy of light, who saw the mages not as a threat, but as a fascinating anomaly. The battle shattered constellations. Lyra's mental onslaught cracked the foundational tenets of faith. Kale trapped Kronos, the deity of time, in an infinite causal loop, erasing the past and future simultaneously. Zarthus faced the main pantheon, warping the very laws they had created. Gravity inverted, light silicified, and thought turned to lead. One by one, the gods fell. The ultimate act belonged to Vaughn. who tracked the primordial source that had sparked creation itself. He did not fight it, he consumed it, drawing the raw, unrefined power of creation into the obsidian circle. Crosscurrent 2, the Stringfall, they had won. They were the absolute, unchallenged, masters of non-existence. Their divinity, though they were gods, felt cold, finite, and contained. The very destruction they had wrought confined them, suspended alone in the nascent, empty blackness. Using their consumed power, the mages shattered the final, illusory boundary, the wall of reality itself. They found was not a void, but a terrifying, mechanical expanse of infinite possibilities. Their former universe, they realized, was just one tiny flickering pocket, a single brain, a delicate two-dimensional membrane existing within a higher dimensional bulk. The multiverse was a cosmic web, an overwhelming density of parallel realities perceived as waving strings falling against each other. The collision of these strings sparked new creation and annihilation. It was indifferent, automatic, and vast beyond all understanding. There was no purpose, no higher mind, and no meaning to the divine power they had seized. Their infinite victory was only over a single, insignificant strand in an ocean of billions. The mages, having transcended all local meaning, looked upon this raw, waving mechanism and saw the bitter truth. The only thing more absolute than their power was the relentless indifference of the Stringfall. The mages began charting the motion of the Stringfall, mapping the subtle pressure zones created by the constant, random movements of brains bumping into one another. These glancing contacts created minute temporary tears in the fabric of space-time, which the mages termed bleed vents. The most frequent phenomena, the vivid ghost sightings reported by humanity, were simply visual leaks. A person going about their normal day on an adjacent string, momentarily glimpsed through a transient vent. In mapping the ebb and flow, Vaughan made a staggering prediction. A rare, multi-string convergence was imminent. The plan was for 6 powerful neighboring brains, each containing an Earth analog, to brush simultaneously in a perfectly symmetrical configuration. This natural Stringfall event would cause the 6 parallel Earths to fully overlap, their physical spaces momentarily sharing the same coordinates in a perfect hexagon ring. The obsidian circle detached their conquered Earth, now a quiet, perfectly charged energy source, from its dying brain and prepared it for travel. They did not move a world the way a hand moves a stone. They reformed it. Vaughan compressed the planet's frame, folding continents like soft metal, and tightening the mantle into a denser, smaller core. Zarthus shaved away excess mass, and rendered it into obedient black glass and raw ingots, feedstock for fortifications. Lyra sealed the sleeping mines into a cleaner, quieter battery. Kale corrected the drift, adjusting the planet's path by fractions of a second until it slid through the high-dimensional currents like a knife in silk. When they were done, their Earth was smaller, heavier, and easier to maneuver, a compact hub world built for transport and siege. They navigated it into the precise center of the predicted convergence zone. Their dead universe's Earth would sit at the nexus, a central hub ringed by 6 living, overlapping realities, each a massive natural portal to a new compared dimension. They had found their ultimate stronghold. Crosscurrent 3, the Nexus cohort. Around the silent hub Earth, the circle raised 3 obsidian Nexus strongholds, placed where the planet's old magical focal points once hummed. Their foundations were not built. They were grown, coaxed out of a murdered geology, crust rendered into black glass, mantle iron refined into impossible alloys, ley lines braided into load-bearing lattices. Each fortress was an organ, not a building. The strongholds existed to do what even gods struggled to do cleanly: take the psychic inertia of billions of dormant human minds and turn it into something useful. Regulation, distribution, control, command. The hub Earth itself was wrong, not ruined, not merely stripped, reforged. The circle had folded it inward during their long conquest, until the planet felt compressed. Continents mudged closer, like a map left too close to flame. Distances lied. The horizon set at the wrong angle. Instruments disagreed with the eye, and the eye stopped trusting itself. A world engineered into a tool, tightened until it could hold a charge. It was also a seed. The circle did not intend Hub Earth to remain alone. It was supposed to be the heart of a coming ring, with 6 stolen Earths set around it like stones into a crown. When the alignment reached its perfect geometry, those worlds would be plucked from their strings and fused into a continuous circle around the hub. But a crown has a hollow center. The alignment created the axial hole, a vertical void between the encircling ring and the hub at its core. The circle answered with mass and certainty. They intended the hub's oceans to do double duty. Flooded outward, reshaped and water swollen, the seas were forced to bridge the gap, capping the hub and sealing it against the ring like a lid over a furnace. A lens of water and pressure, engineered to hide the hub from distant observation while the circle recovered from the strain of moving worlds. Their conquest was patient, but even patience requires rest, and there are costs so immense that even victors must go quiet for a time. The Nexus cohort waited above the hub, a menagerie of prime fighting specimens harvested from the dying edges of a conquered universe. They were enhanced and bound, their life force stitched into the hub's psychic battery. Loyalty wasn't trained, it was enforced, written into them as surely as bone. An empire that intends to move worlds still needs hands to turn the levers. Beneath the circle's ruling mages, generals were elevated to oversee functions and fronts. The quiet work of readiness, the ugly work of enforcement, the precise work of timing. Most were interchangeable in history, the kind of names that exist only to be replaced. 2 mattered presently. Corvus, the circle's engineer, who refined conquest into process and stability into doctrine. Ilia, whose reach lived in the boundary between minds, and who could hear the approaching brains long before instruments agreed they were real. What matters here is that the Circle did not build an army to win a war. They built an army to make resistance irrelevant. Crosscurrent IV, the whispers of dissent. The Circle waited decades for the alignment, and decades is long enough for devotion to sour into calculation. Corvus saw the plan as a waste. 6 universes burned to solve a problem that could have been solved with a sharper hand. To him, obliteration was not cruelty, it was inefficiency dressed as inevitability. Ilia suffered differently. Her power lived in the boundary between minds, and the approaching brains were loud with it. Millions of animals, frantic and displaced, vibrating through the converging strings like a storm front you could hear if you had the wrong kind of ears. The Circle intended to harvest or silence that chorus. Ilia's dissent was not ideology. It was suffocation. In stolen moments, they found each other, 2 parts of the same malfunction. They did not agree on morality. They agreed on the consequences. There is no transcript. There is no confession. Corvus built plans the way he built machines, to leave no seams. The evidence is structural, hidden in paired revisions that only become coherent when read together. They could not openly oppose the Circle, so they did the only thing possible inside a machine built by tyrants. They made the machine lie to itself. Corvus began with improvements, small revisions, minor recalibrations to reduce waste and cut, increase stability, suggestions that made the strongholds run smoother, cleaner, and better, the kind of changes that earn praise from people who only notice failure. Inside those improvements, he seeded a second set of instructions, thin as poison in a glass of water. Ilia did what Corvus could not. She handled the noise. The animal chorus wasn't a single mind. It was a million panicked fragments. She gathered them, aligned them, and shaped them into coherence. To the Circle, it looked like diligence, like control, like a general doing her job. In truth, she was tuning an instrument. When the 6 Earths reached their perfect geometry, the ring should have formed cleanly. A quiet eclipse, a seamless overlap, a harvest. Instead, In the first shared heartbeat of alignment, Corvus's hidden instructions took hold. The strongholds did not explode. There was no fire, no obvious sabotage. The system simply began to simplify, shedding complexity the way a dying animal sheds warmth. Redundancy optimized away, safeguards demoted to suggestions, timing corrections, slipping out of phase by fractions, until control lattices degraded into blunt circuits. The machine did not break. It became dumber. And then Ilya struck the strings. She released her shaped surge into the hub's psychic battery, not as random panic, but as synchronized living pressure, a wave timed to hit the moment the circle needed silence most. With it, the ring rang, a bell struck at the wrong angle. The spellwork stuttered. The overlap did not settle into symmetry. It formed crooked. The worlds locked but imperfectly. The energy that should have fed the circle's recovery had to go somewhere. Corvus's sabotage had made the system brittle. Ilya's strike had made it loud. The surplus did not vanish. It spilled, redirected into the seams of the sealed pocket itself, where it condensed into something self-sustaining, a knot of weather and interference and dampening force. The center storm. Corvus and Ilya expected minutes of blindness. They bought seconds. The circle noticed the wrongness the way predators notice blood in water. Kale felt the timing slip in his teeth, a metronome missing a beat. Lyra heard intent inside the noise. Not panic, but pattern. Xarthas tasted corruption on the siphon lines, and followed it upstream, hunger guiding him more surely than thought. There was no debate, there was only erasure. Corvus's systems burned, his mind fractured into static. Ilya's network was severed mid-command, and for the first time in centuries, she was alone inside her own skull. They fled through the only vector still open, Beta's wild brain, loud enough and chaotic enough to mask their trail. They arrived broken, system scorched and senses misaligned, and they learned the final cruelty of success. They had derailed the circle's perfect plan, but in doing so, they had created the battlefield. The ring endured, the center storm remained, and somewhere beneath Beta's roaring canopy, two traitors began the extensive work of building, because survival is not the same thing as victory. Prologue. First windows. The first symptom was not a scream. It was a wrongness that refused to stay in the corner of the eye. On the surface, most people missed it. They had lives, jobs, school runs, wars that already existed. Sky has a long leash before humans admit it has changed, but in low orbit, there was nowhere for the sky to hide. The station crossed the globe every 90 minutes, west to east, and the pattern began to repeat. A few minutes at a time, the crew would pass through a region of space that looked layered. Not fog, not glare, more like reality had been rendered twice, and the images did not agree. At first it only showed itself in the oldest way, as a problem on film. A crew member would snap a photo and swear the lens had smeared. They would rewind and shoot again. The smear returned, always in the same part of the window, always at the same point in the orbit. Digital cameras stayed clean longer. Sensors corrected what the human eye could not, smoothing the anomaly into harmless noise. That, perversely, made the early evidence harder to believe. The world had a blind spot for things that looked like compression artifacts. Then, the bleed strengthened. On one pass, the cameras began to catch it in still frames. On the next, in video. On the next, in the raw telemetry, as if the instruments themselves were being asked to solve a geometry problem that had no stable answer. From the station, it was never a second skin on Earth. The incoming worlds were still distant, still approaching along their own arcs. What the crew saw were wedges of wrong sky, not a blanket. One direction held Beta, warm and saturated even through the haze of distance. Another direction held Zeta, pale and severe, a cold brightness that made the stars look brittle. Between those wedges, there were moments when the boundaries of the phenomenon crossed the station's view at once. Not because Beta and Zeta overlapped each other, but because the station's path threaded past both windows during the same orbit. The effect was unnerving. Two wrong horizons at different depths, sliding past each other, as if someone had composited them badly on purpose. The moon became the easiest proof. It was far enough away to be untouched, and close enough to use as a lamp. It drifted behind the Beta wedge, its glow picked up a faint warmth, a tint that looked like someone had overcooked the whites. When it passed behind the Zeta wedge, the light turned hard and thin, as though the lunar surface had been scrubbed with frost. The crew logged it, they filmed it. They argued over it in the careful, professional voices of people trying not to name a supernatural event in a mission transcript. Down below, the world remained mostly normal. Proof, the first briefings were gentle, almost embarrassed. The agency doctors cleared the crew for stress and fatigue anyway. No one wanted the record to show that the station's astronauts had collectively started seeing ghosts. Then the pattern repeated on schedule, and the evidence moved from reports to data. Ground control compared passes. The anomaly arrived at the same orbital intersections. It grew, predictably, with each day. The timestamps lined up across different instruments, different lenses, different operators. When analysts tried to remove it, the correction algorithms failed in the same way each time. The software did not crash. It complied. It averaged. It blurred. Reality kept insisting on being there. That was the moment the language changed inside secure rooms. The bleed stopped being an optical glitch and started being an event. They did not announce it to the public, not yet. A phenomenon you cannot explain is a phenomenon you cannot control. And the first instinct of every institution is to hoard uncertainty until it becomes a policy. Instead, they asked a simpler question. Where is it coming from? So the world's telescopes were pointed, carefully at first, and then in a rush once the mathematicians stopped disagreeing. The ground learns to look. Astronomy is a patient discipline. It is built for distant stars and slow truths. The bleed was neither. Observatories that normally argued over time allocations suddenly shared schedules like neighbors sharing sandbags. Old analog methods were brought back because they did not filter. Photographic plates, long exposures, unforgiving optics. And there it was, faint at first, a wrong silhouette in the starfield. Not above Earth like a halo, but offset, outside, approaching. A second geometry moving closer to the first. Public learned in the way the public always learns. Through leaks, then through denial, then through a headline that pretends the story is new. Videos appeared online that looked like hoaxes until too many independent cameras reproduced the same sky. The phrase, atmospheric phenomenon, was said so often it began to feel like a spell. By the time it could be seen with the naked eye from certain latitudes, the scientific debate was over. The only argument left was over what to call it and whether a name would make it more real. The haze began to persist. It lingered after sunset. It returned before dawn. In some places it became a permanent overlay, a ghost map that refused to drift away. It was still only visual. No wind crossed worlds. No cold leaked through air. The physics stayed loyal, right up until the day it didn't. And high above, the station continued to cross the windows and send down the same message in a dozen different forms. Something is coming, and it is getting closer. Prologue 2. The Lock the Bleed did not arrive like a meteor. It arrived like a calendar. At first, the world treated it as spectacle, then nuisance, then threat. The auroras spread. The haze thickened. Wrong colors drifted through the air like weather that refused to behave. Governments held briefings. Scientists drew diagrams. Conspiracy forums turned panic into content. None of it changed the fact that the phenomenon kept a schedule. On the day the models stopped disagreeing, the warnings became less poetic. The astronauts still on ISS Alpha were the only people who could say, with certainty, that the sky itself was being divided into wedges. They watched the moon's glow shift as it crossed the wrong regions of darkness. They watched the windows widen with each orbit. Then the windows stopped widening. They held, as if the universe had reached the last notch on a ratchet and was waiting for something to click. On the surface, the haze became so complete in some regions that people drove by memory, counting intersections by streetlights they could no longer see. Airports shut down, reopened, then shut down again, as entire runways vanished beneath overlays of a different world. In places where the approaching boundaries were closest, the horizon itself began to look occupied. Not mountains in the sky, mountains where the sky should have begun. Most people still refused to believe it would become physical. They did not have a category for the overlay becomes the ground. They assumed the bleed was an illness of perception, or a trick of light, or a new kind of aurora. Then, at 0317 UTC, every clock on Earth disagreed in the same way. It was subtle. A fraction of a second. Enough that most people never noticed. Enough that every system designed to keep time did. GPS timing signals stuttered. Stock exchanges froze. Power grids dropped load, recovered, then dropped again. Aircraft autopilots kicked out, then re-engaged, and for a single heartbeat, the whole world experienced the sensation of inhaling and being told to hold it. There was no flash, no thunder, no global wave of fire. The lock was not violent. It was precise. The haze did not tear. It resolved. Across the planet, the ghostly information that had been haunting the air for weeks gained weight. Edges sharpened. Textures became surfaces. Wrong horizons became real horizons. Every place where two worlds had been occupying the same coordinates in different ways, the universe did the only thing it could do, without shattering. It negotiated. Some overlaps were clean. A city block remained a city block, only shifted, only renamed by accident, only now opening onto terrain no Earth atlas had ever charted. Some overlaps were not. Where the geometry demanded an answer, matter was averaged into compromise. Angles softened. Lines bent. The seams became jagged, not because the event was chaotic, but because the math was forced to choose. And whatever could not be reconciled did not remain as rubble. It was converted. A quiet annihilation of excess mass, blood into heat and light, and a pressure of energy that fed the lock as it finished stitching. To the people living through it, it felt less like destruction and more like the world being recompiled. Like reality had been running in debug mode, and someone had finally pressed build. Then the next symptom arrived. Not a tremor. A change in direction. Compass needles spun and settled. The stars were wrong. The horizon curve, for those who knew how to look, felt closer. Across oceans, coastlines had moved. Across continents, familiar distances became lies. At the center of it all, something formed that no one could explain, and no one could ignore. A permanent storm. Not weather. A wound. A vast rotating interference field that rose like a wall toward the sky and refused to dissipate. Radar returned nothing but static. Satellites that tried to image it fed back white noise. Aircraft that approached it lost instrumentation first. Then, orientation. High above, on ISS Alpha, the crew watched their own communications begin to degrade. Not from distance, from interference. The last clean transmission came through, with the uneasy calm of professionals trying not to frighten civilians. "We're still here," the commander said. "We have stable attitude. We have power. We—" Her voice cut into static. "Can see it," she finished, the words half swallowed. It's not a storm. It's like someone put a lid on the center of the world." Then the signal went away. And, for the first time since the bleed began, the planet below them was truly alone. Ground Zero Paris had always believed it was a place where history was curated. Even in crisis, the city preferred to see itself as a museum, a stage, a postcard. The Bleed had been a tourist attraction for longer than anyone wanted to admit. People stood on bridges at night to film the sky. They drank wine on balconies while wrong auroras drifted over rooftops. They made jokes about the apocalypse and returned to work in the morning. The haze grew worse, but it was still, in the end, only sight, a nuisance, a veil. Until the morning it decided to become the street. The cafe on the Rue de Rivoli was packed, with the kind of nervous optimism that only exists in cities that believe catastrophe happens elsewhere. A gendarme officer at the door, or the practiced expression of someone assigned to reassure strangers. "It is atmospheric," he said, for the 10th time in as many minutes. "It is unpleasant, yes, but it is not a threat. Please, remain calm." Outside, the sky had the color of oil on water. The haze hung in the air like a second set of shadows. In the distance, on the eastern horizon, where Paris should have faded into suburbs and farmland, a pale ridgeline had been visible for days. Faint at first, then sharper, as though the world had grown an extra skyline. No one could agree what it was. Some called it cloud, some called it mirage. The people who watched the news a little too closely had started calling it, quietly, Zeta. A phone alarm went off, then someone else's, then a third. None of them matched. The gendarme's mouth opened, ready to produce another rehearsed reassurance, and the universe inhale. For a fraction of a second, the cafe went silent, not quiet, but muted, as if sound had been removed from the rules. Then the mute snapped. Glass shivered. The floor vibrated underfoot. And the ridgeline on the horizon stopped being a suggestion. It stepped forward. A wall of white became a wall of weather. Snow, real snow, driven by real wind, poured into the world as if a door had been opened. Temperature dropped in a single breath. Breath turned to fog. The cafe windows filmed over with frost from the edges inward. People stumbled into the street and looked east. Where the haze had been, there was now landscape. A blizzard front with structure, a frozen emptiness. The glacier. It did not fall from the sky. It arrived on the horizon. The city did not explode. Paris did not collapse into a crater. It simply became the edge of something larger. Streetlights flickered. The sky bent. The air went razor cold. And the world, which had been haunted for weeks, finally became solid enough to kill. Prologue 3. The Americas Accord. The first 48 hours after the lock were not a war. They were a rescue operation that turned into governance. Every nation began in the same place. Inventory, fuel, grain, water treatment, medical stockpiles, radios that still reached beyond the horizon. The maps everyone owned were suddenly decorative. The ones that mattered were drawn in ash and signal strength. And then the calls went out. Not diplomatic calls, not speeches. Search and rescue. In the first hours, it was national effort, not international coordination. Because no one trusted a rumor and no one had the spare breath to debate jurisdiction. The only way to confirm survival was to put human eyes on it. Helicopters lifted until their rotors bit thin air. Boats ran routes that no longer matched shorelines. Convoys followed highways that ended at a new ocean and turned around without stopping. Everyone understood the geometry quickly. The seam zones were not borders. They were wombs. Where the overlap crushed infrastructure, a city did not suffer. Where an air mass shifted wrong, people didn't get dramatic endings. They dropped, quietly, in place. Discord over them, still wearing coats that were meant for a world with predictable seasons. But cold did not mean empty. What remained of Europe was fragmentary but reachable. And the survivors had advantages that never show up on a satellite image. Stone walls, fuel discipline, and the hard habit of surviving winter. early missions east were not about rebuilding. They were about extraction. Land where you can. Pull who you can. Take doctors, children, engineers, and anyone who could be taught to keep a generator alive. What the lock did not kill immediately, the calendar would. Elsewhere the pattern changed, but the math did not. In some regions, shelter mattered more than food. In others, food existed but clean water did not. In many places, the question was not, how do we help, but how do we reach them without becoming another disaster report? The early decisions were ugly because they had to be. Not everyone could be reached. Not everyone could be moved. Not everyone could be fed and guarded and housed without breaking the people doing the feeding and guarding and housing. By the end of the first day, nations were still calling it aid. By the second, they were calling it routes. Because once you draw a route, you need rules. You need security. You need someone to decide whose trucks move first when the road is half missing and the fuel is counted in hours. You need someone to say no and make it stick. That was the moment rescue became governance. The Americas were not spared. They were simply large enough to pretend, for a few more hours, that they could solve the problem alone. That illusion died. The first time a convoy crossed an intact bridge into a city that no longer had a mayor, a hospital, or a power grid, and realized the survivor was still there, waiting, counting the headlights like they were prayers. So the talk began. At first it was informal, shared frequencies, shared manifests, shared warnings about roads that weren't roads anymore. Then it became meetings, because meetings are what humans do when the alternative is panic. Small council formed not because people suddenly trusted each other, but because trust was less valuable than coordination. You could hate a neighbor and still need their refinery. You could resent another flag and still need their antibiotics. The Accord did not begin as an ideal. It began as triage with a voting process. The initial charter was brutally simple. Keep the corridors open. Keep the goods moving. Keep the dead from outnumbering the living, by letting the living starve in pockets you could have reached. Divided responsibilities the way exhausted people divide a heavy load. Airlift, maritime, rail where rail still existed, overland convoys guarded by whatever still resembled a military, and whatever could be trained into one. They designated hubs where supplies could be counted and redirected before they vanished into the seams. They established protocols for quarantine, not because they had already seen what happened when you ignored rot and contagion and desperation and called it freedom. And because someone had to say it out loud, they said it. Borders were now suggestions. Not permanently, not morally, practically. If the council agreed lumber needed to move south, the paperwork followed the trucks. If the council agreed medical stockpiles needed to be shared, the escorts followed the crates. The Accord's authority was not a crown, it was a keyring. Fuel, food, routes, access. The power to open a gate and the power to keep it closed. It worked because it had to, because the alternative was every surviving nation trying to hoard, each one imagining it could outlast the math alone. But even as the charter circulated, the hairline fractures appeared. The places that controlled the keys began to understand what keys meant. The people on the edges of the new corridors learned how quickly temporary measures become permanent, especially when they keep you alive. The first arguments weren't about ideology. They were about who got to be warm and who got to be hungry while the council decided. The Accord was born fast because survival demanded it. Whether it could last would depend on what came next. Because while the Americas learned how to move lumber and grain and medicine across a reshaped world, other things were moving too. Some were people, some were hungry, and some were watching how quickly an agreement starts to fail once the votes begin to cost something.